Unit 4 Psychological Disorders. Introduction. You must have come across people who are unhappy, troubled, and dissatisfied. Their minds and hearts are filled with sorrow, unrest, and tension, and they feel they are unable to move ahead in their lives. They feel life is a painful uphill struggle, sometimes not worth living. Famous analytical psychologist Carl Jung has quietly remarkably said, "How can I be substantial without casting a shadow? I must have a dark side too. If I am to be whole and by becoming conscious of my shadow, I remember once more that I am a human being like any other." At times, some of you may have felt nervous before an important examination, tense and concerned about your future career, or anxious when someone close to you was unwell. All of us face major problems at some point of our lives. However, some people have an extreme reaction to the problems and stresses of life. In this chapter, we will try to understand what goes wrong when people develop psychological problems, what are the causes and factors which lead to abnormal behavior, and what are the various signs and symptoms associated with different types of psychological disorders. The study of psychological disorders has intrigued and mystified all cultures for more than 2500 years. Psychological disorders or mental disorders, like anything unusual, may make us uncomfortable and even a little frightened. Unhappiness, discomfort, anxiety, and unrealized potential are seen all over the world. These failures in living are due to mainly to failures in adaptation to life challenges. As you must have studied in the previous chapters, adaptation refers to a person's ability to modify her or his behavior in response to changing environmental requirements. When the behavior cannot be modified according to the needs of the situation, it is said to be maladaptive. Abnormal psychology is the area within psychology that is focused on maladaptive behavior, its causes, consequences, and treatment. Concept of abnormality and psychological disorders. Although many definitions of abnormality has been overused in the previous years, none has won universal acceptance. Still, most definitions have certain common features, often called the 4Ds. Defines distress, dysfunction, and danger. That is, psychological disorders are deviant, distressing, dysfunctional, and possibly dangerous. This definition is a useful starting point from which we can explore psychological abnormality. Since the word abnormal literally means away from normal, it implies deviation from some clearly defined norms or standards. In psychology, we have no ideal model or even normal model of human behavior to use as a base for comparison. Various approaches have been used in distinguishing between normal and abnormal behaviors. From these approaches, there emerge two basic and conflicting views. The first approach views abnormal behavior as deviation from social norms. Many psychologists have stated that abnormal is simply a label that is given to a behavior which is deviant from social expectations. Abnormal behavior, thoughts, and emotions are those that differ markedly from a society's ideas of proper functioning. Each society has norms, which are stated or unstated rules for proper conduct. Behaviors, thoughts, and emotions that break societal norms are called abnormal. Society's norms grow from its particular culture, its history, values, institutions, habits, skills, technology, and arts. Thus, a society whose culture values competition and assertiveness may accept aggressive behavior, whereas one that emphasizes cooperation and family values may consider aggressive behavior as unacceptable or even abnormal. A society's values may change over time, causing its views of what is psychologically abnormal to change as well. Serious questions have been raised about this definition. It is based on the assumption that socially accepted behavior is not abnormal and that normality is nothing more than conformity to social norms. The second approach views abnormal behavior as maladaptive. Many psychologists believe that the best criterion for determining the normality of behavior is not whether society accepts it, but whether it fosters the well being of an individual and eventually of the group to which he or she belongs. Well being is not simply maintenance and survival, but also includes growth and fulfillment. That is the actualization of potential, which you must have studied in Maslow's need of hierarchy theory. According to this criterion, conforming behavior can be seen as abnormal if it is maladaptive, that is, if it interferes the optimal functioning and growth. For example, a student in the class prefers to remain silent when she or he has questions in her mind or his mind. Describing behavior as maladaptive implies that a problem exists. It also suggests that vulnerability in the individual, inability to cope, or exceptional stress in environment have led to problem in life. If you talk to people around, you'll see that vague ideas about psychological disorders that are characterized by superstition, ignorance, and fear. Again, it is commonly believed that psychological disorders is something to be ashamed of. The stigma attached to mental illness means the people are hesitant to consult a doctor or psychologist because they are ashamed of their problems. Actually, psychological disorder, which indicates a failure in adaptation, should be viewed as any other illness. Historical background. To understand psychological disorders, we would require a brief historical account of how these disorders have been viewed over the ages. When we study history of abnormal psychology, we find that certain theories have occurred over and over again. One ancient theory that is still encountered today holds that abnormal behavior can be explained by operation of supernatural and magical forces such as evil spirits. Exorcism, that is removing the evil that resides in an individual through counter magic and prayer, is still commonly used. In many societies, a shaman or medicine man is a person who is believed to have contact with supernatural forces and is the medium through which spirits communicate with human beings. Through the shaman, an afflicted person can learn which spirits are responsible for her or his problems and what needs to be done to appease them. A recurring theme in the history of abnormal psychology is the belief that individuals behave strangely because their bodies and their brains are not working properly. This is the biological or organic approach. In the modern era, there is evidence that body and brain processes have been linked to many types of maladaptive behavior. For certain types of disorders, correcting these defective biological processes results in improved functioning. Another approach is psychological approach. According to this point of view, psychological problems are caused by inadequacies in the way an individual thinks, feels, or perceives the world. All of these perspectives, supernatural, biological, or organic, and psychological, have recurred throughout the history of Western civilization. In the ancient Western world, it was philosophers, physicians of ancient Greece such as Hippocrates, Socrates, and in particular Plato who developed the organism approach and viewed the disturbed behavior as arising out of conflicts between emotion and reason. Galen elaborated on the role of the four humors in personal character and temperament. According to him, the material world was made up of four motor elements, viz. Earth, air, fire, and water, which combined to form four essential body fluids, viz. Blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. Each of these fluids was seen to be responsible for a different temperament. Imbalance among the humors were believed to cause various disorders. This is similar to Indian notion of three doshas or Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, which were mentioned in Atharvaveda and Ayurvedic texts. You have already read about it in chapter 2. In the Middle Ages, demonology and superstition gained renewed importance in the explanation of abnormal behavior. Demonology related to a belief that people with mental problems were evil, and there are numerous instances of witch hunts during this period. During the early Middle Ages, the Christian spirit of charity prevailed, and St. Augustine wrote extensively about feelings, mental anguish, and conflict. This laid the groundwork for modern psychodynamic theories of abnormal behavior. The Renaissance period was marked by increased humanism and curiosity about behavior. Johann Weyer emphasized psychological conflict and causes of psychological disorders. He also insisted that witches were mentally disturbed and required medical and theological treatment. The 17th and 18th century was known as the age of reason and enlightenment, as the scientific method replaced faith and dogma as ways of understanding abnormal behavior. The growth of a scientific attitude towards psychological disorders in the 18th century contributed to the reform movement and to increase compassion for people who suffered from these disorders. Reforms and asylums were initiated in both Europe and America. One aspect of the reform movement was new inclination of deinstitutionalization, which placed emphasis on providing community care for recovery of mentally ill individuals. In recent years, there has been a convergence of these approaches, which has resulted in interactional biopsychosocial approach. From this perspective, all three factors, biological, psychological, and social, play important roles in influencing expression and outcome of psychological disorders. Classification of psychological disorders. In order to understand psychological disorders, we need to begin by classifying them. A classification of such disorders consists of a list of categories of specific psychological disorders grouped into various classes on the basis of some shared characteristics. Classifications are useful because they enable users like psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers to communicate with each other about the disorder and help in understanding the causes of psychological disorders and the process involved in their development and maintenance. The American Psychiatric Association (APA) has published an official manual describing and classifying various kinds of psychological disorders. The current version of it, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 4th edition, evaluates the patient on 5 axes or dimensions rather than just one broad aspect of mental disorder. These dimensions relate to biological, psychological, social, and other aspects. The classification scheme officially used in India and elsewhere is the 10th revision of International Classification of Diseases, which is known as ICD-10 Classification of Behavioral and Mental Disorders. It was prepared by World Health Organization. For each disorder, a description of the main clinical features or symptoms and of other associated features, including diagnostic guidelines, is provided in this scheme. Factors underlying abnormal behavior. In order to understand something as complex as abnormal behavior, psychologists used different approaches. Each approach is used today emphasizes a different aspect of human behavior and explains and treats abnormality in line with that aspect. These approaches also emphasize the role of different factors such as biological, psychological, and interpersonal and socio-cultural factors. We'll examine some of the approaches which are currently being used to determine and explain abnormal behavior. Biological factors influence all aspects of our behavior. A wide range of biological factors such as faulty genes, endocrine imbalances, malnutrition, injuries, and other conditions may interfere with normal body development and functioning of the human body. These factors may be potential causes of abnormal behavior. We have already come across biological model. According to this model, abnormal behavior has a biochemical or physiological basis. Biological researchers have found that 5 psychological disorders are often related to problems in the transmission of messages from one neuron to another. You have studied in class 11 that a tiny space called synapse separates one neuron from another, and the message just moves across the space. When an electrical impulse reaches a neuron's ending, the nerve ending is called stimulated to a release of chemical called neurotransmitter. Studies indicate that abnormal activity by certain neurotransmitters can lead to specific psychological disorders. Anxiety disorders have been linked to low activity of neurotransmitter gamma aminobutyric acid GABA. Schizophrenia to excess activity of dopamine, and depression to low activity of serotonin. Genetic factors have been linked to mood disorders, schizophrenia, mental retardation, and other psychological disorders. Researchers have not, however, been able to identify the specific genes that are the culprits. It appears that in most cases, no single gene is responsible for the particular behavior or a psychological disorder. In fact, many genes combine to help bring about various behaviors and emotional reactions, both functional and dysfunctional. Although there is sound evidence to believe that genetic biochemical factors are involved in mental disorders as diverse as schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, etc., and biology alone cannot account for most mental disorders. There are several psychological models which provide a psychological explanation of mental disorders. These models maintain that psychological and interpersonal factors have significant role to play in abnormal behavior. These factors include maternal deprivation, separation from mother or lack of warmth, and stimulation during early years of life, faulty parent-child relationships, maladaptive family structures, and severe stress. The psychological models include the psychodynamic, behavioral, cognitive, and humanistic existential model. The psychodynamic model is the oldest and most famous model of the modern psychological models. You have already read about this model in chapter 2 on self and personality. Psychodynamic theorists believe that behavior, whether normal or abnormal, is determined by psychological forces within the person of which she or he is not consciously aware. These internal forces are considered dynamic, that is, they interact with one another and their interaction gives shape to behavior, thoughts, and emotions. Abnormal symptoms are viewed as a result of conflicts between these forces. This model was first formulated by Freud, who believed that three central forces shape personality: instinctual needs, rights and impulses, rational thinking, and moral standards. Freud stated that abnormal behavior is a symbolic expression of unconscious mental conflicts that can be generally traced to early childhood or infancy. Another model that emphasizes the role of psychological factors is the behavioral model. This model states that both normal and abnormal behaviors are learned, and psychological disorders are the result of learning maladaptive ways of behaving. The model concentrates on behaviors that are learned through conditioning and proposes that what has been learned can be unlearned. Learning can take place by classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning. These three types of behaviors, conditioning account for behavior, whether adaptive or maladaptive. Psychological factors are also emphasized by the cognitive model. This model states that abnormal functioning can result from cognitive problems. People may hold assumptions and attitudes about themselves that are irrational and inaccurate. People may also repeatedly think in illogical ways and make overgeneralizations. That is, they may draw broad, negative conclusions on the basis of a single insignificant event. Another psychological model is the humanistic existential model, which focuses on broader aspects of human existence. Humanists believe that human beings are born with a natural tendencies to be friendly, cooperative, and constructive, and are driven to self-actualize, that is, to fulfill this potential for goodness and growth. Existentialists believe that from birth we have total freedom to give meaning to our existence or to avoid that responsibility. Those who shirk from this responsibility would live empty, inauthentic, and dysfunctional lives. In addition to biological and psychosocial factors, social cultural factors such as war and violence, group prejudice and discrimination, economic and employment problems, and rapid social change put stress on most of us and can also lead us to psychological problems in some individuals. According to the socio-cultural model, abnormal behavior is best understood in light of the social and cultural forces that influence an individual. As behavior is shaped by societal forces, factors such as family structure and communication, social networks, societal conditions, and societal labels and roles become more important. It has been found that certainly family systems are likely to produce abnormal functioning in individual or members. Some families have an enmeshed structure in which the members are over involved in each other's activities, thoughts, and feelings. Children from this kind of family may have difficulty in becoming independent in life. The broader social networks in which humans operate include their social and professional relationships. Studies have shown that people who are isolated and lack social support, that is, strong and fulfilling interpersonal relationships in their lives, are likely to become more depressed and depressed longer than those who have good friendships. Sociocultural theorists also believe that abnormal functioning is influenced by societal labels and roles assigned to troubled people. When people break the norms of their society, they are called deviant and mentally ill. Such label tends to stick so that the person may be viewed as crazy and encouraged to act sick. The person gradually learns to accept and play the sick role and functions in a disturbed manner. In addition to these models, one of the most widely accepted explanations of abnormal behavior has been provided by the diathesis stress model. This model states that psychological disorders develop when a diathesis is set up by a stressful situation. This model has three components. The first is the diathesis, or the presence of some biological aberration which may be inherited. The second component is that diathesis may carry a vulnerability to develop a psychological disorder. This means that the person is at risk or predisposed to develop the disorder. The third component is the presence of pathogenic stressors, factors that may lead to psychopathology. If such at-risk persons are exposed to these stressors, their predisposition may actually evolve into a disorder. This model has been applied to several disorders including anxiety, depression, and schizophrenia. Major psychological disorders. Anxiety disorders. One day while driving home, Deb felt his heartbeat beating rapidly. He started sweating profusely and even felt short of breath. He was so scared that he stopped the car and stepped out. In the next few months, these attacks increased. Now he was hesitant to drive for fear of being caught in traffic during an attack. Deb started feeling that he had gone crazy and would die. Soon he remained indoors and refused to move out of the house. We experience anxiety when we are waiting to take an examination or to visit a dentist or even to give a solo performance. This is normal and expected and even motivates us to do our task well. On the other hand, high levels of anxiety that are distressing and interfere with effective functioning indicate the presence of an anxiety disorder. The most common category of psychological disorders. Everyone has worries and fears. The term anxiety is usually defined as a diffuse, vague, very unpleasant feeling of fear and apprehension. The anxious individual also shows a combination of the following symptoms: rapid heart rate, shortness of breath, diarrhea, loss of appetite, fainting, dizziness, sweating, sleeplessness, frequent urination, and tremors. There are many types of anxiety disorders. They include generalized anxiety disorder, which consists of prolonged, vague, unexplained, and intense fears that are not attached to any particular object. The symptoms include worry and apprehensive feelings about the future, hypervigilance, which involves constantly scanning the environment for dangers. It is marked by motor tension, as a result of which the person is unable to relax and visibly shaky and tense. Another type of anxiety disorder is panic disorder, which consists of recurrent anxiety attacks in which the person experiences intense terror. A panic attack denotes an abrupt surge of intense anxiety rising to a peak when thoughts of a particular stimuli are present. Such thoughts occur in an unpredictable manner. The clinical features include shortness of breath, dizziness, trembling palpitations, choking, nausea, chest pain or discomfort, fear of going crazy, losing control or dying. You might have met or heard someone who has afraid to travel in a lift or climb to the 10th floor of a building, or refused to enter a room if she or he saw a lizard. You may have also felt it yourself, seen a friend unable to skip a word of a well memorized and rehearsed speech from before an audience. These kind of fears are termed as phobias. People who have phobias have irrational fears related to specific objects, people, or situations. Phobias often develop gradually or begin with a generalized anxiety disorder. Phobias can be grouped into three main types, that is specific phobias, social phobias, and agoraphobia. Specific phobias are the most commonly occurring type of phobia. This group includes irrational fears such as intense fears of a certain type of animal or being in an enclosed space. Intense and incapacitating fear and embarrassment when dealing with others characterizes social phobias. Agoraphobia is the term used when people develop a fear of entering unfamiliar situations. Many agoraphobics are afraid of leaving their home, so their ability to carry out normal life activities is severely limited. Have you ever noticed someone washing their hands every time they touch something? Or washing even things like coins or stepping only within the patterns on the floor or road while walking? People affected by obsessive compulsive disorder are unable to control their preoccupation with specific ideas or are unable to prevent themselves from repeatedly carrying out a particular act or series of acts that affect their ability to carry out normal activities. Obsessive behavior is the ability to stop thinking about a particular idea or topic. The person involved often finds themselves these thoughts to be unpleasant and shameful. Compulsive behavior is the need to perform certain behavior over and over again. Many compulsions deal with counting, ordering, checking, touching, and washing. Very often, people who have been caught in a natural disaster or have been victims of bomb blasts, by terrorists, or been in serious accident or in a war-like situation experience post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD). Symptoms vary widely but may include recurrent dreams, flashbacks, impaired concentration, and emotional numbing. Somatoform disorders. These are conditions in which there are physical symptoms in an absence of physical disease. In somatoform disorders, the individual has psychological difficulties and complains of physical symptoms for which there is no biological cause. Somatoform disorders include pain disorders, somatization disorders, conversion disorders, and hypochondriasis. Pain disorders involve reports of extreme and incapacitating pain either without any identifiable biological symptoms or greatly in excess of what might be expected to accompany biological symptoms. How people interpret pain influences their overall adjustment. Some pain sufferers can learn to use active coping, that is, remaining active and ignoring the pain. Others engage in passive coping, which leads to reduced activity and social withdrawal. Patients with somatization disorders have multiple and recurrent or chronic bodily complaints. These complaints are likely to be presented in a dramatic and exaggerated way. Common complaints are headaches, fatigue, heart palpitations, fainting spells, vomiting, and allergies. Patients with this disorder believe that they are sick, provide long and detailed histories of their illness, and take large quantities of medicine. The symptoms of conversion disorders are the reported loss of part of all or some basic body functions. Paralysis, blindness, deafness, and difficulty in walking are generally among the Symptoms reported. These symptoms often occur after a stressful experience and may be quite sudden. Hypochondriasis is diagnosed if a person has a persistent belief that he or she has a serious illness, despite medical reassurance, lack of physical findings, and failure to develop the disease. Hypochondriacs have an obsessive preoccupation and concern with the condition of their bodily organs, and they continually worry about their health. Dissociative disorders. Dissociation can be viewed as severance of connections between ideas and emotions. Dissociation involves feelings of unreality, estrangement, depersonalization, and sometimes a loss of shift of the identity. Sudden temporary alterations of consciousness that blot out painful experiences are a defining characteristic of dissociative disorders. Four conditions are included in this group: dissociative amnesia, dissociative fugue, dissociative identity disorder, and depersonalization. Salient features of somatoform and dissociative disorders are given in box 4.1. Dissociative amnesia is characterized by extensive but selective memory loss that has no known organic cause. Some people cannot remember anything about their past, others can no longer recall specific events, people, places, or objects, while their memory for other events remain intact. This disorder is often associated with an overwhelming stress. Dissociative fugue has as its essential feature an unexpected travel away from home and workplace, the assumption of a new identity, and the inability to recall the previous identity. The fugue always usually ends up when the person suddenly wakes up with no memory of the events that occurred during the fugue. Dissociative identity disorder, often referred to as multiple personality, is the most dramatic of the dissociative disorders. It is associated with traumatic experience in childhood. In this disorder, the person assumes alternate personalities that may or may not be aware of each other. Depersonalization involves a dreamlike state in which the person has a sense of being separated both from self and reality. In depersonalization, there is a change of self perception and the person's sense of reality is temporarily lost or changed. Mood disorders are characterized by disturbances in mood or prolonged emotional state. The most common mood disorder is depression, which covers a variety of negative moods and behavioral changes. Depression can refer to a symptom or a disorder. In day to day life, we often use the term depression to refer normal feelings after a significant loss, such as breakup of a relationship, failure to attain a significant goal. The main types of mood disorders include depressive, manic, and bipolar disorders. Major depressive disorder is defined as a period of depressed mood and loss of interest or pleasure in most activities, together with other symptoms which may include change in body weight, constant sleep problems, tiredness, inability to think clearly, agitation, greatly slowed behavior, and thoughts of death and suicide. Other symptoms include excessive guilt or feelings of worthlessness. Factor predisposing towards disposition. Genetic makeup or heredity is an important risk factor for major depression and bipolar disorders. Age is also a risk factor. For instance, women are particularly at risk during young adulthood, while for men the risk is highest in the early middle age. Similarly, gender also plays a great role in this differential risk addition. For example, women in comparison to men are more likely to report a depressive disorder. Other risk factors are experiencing negative life events and lack of social support. Another less common mood disorder is mania. People suffering from mania become euphoric, extremely active, excessively talkative, and easily distractible. Manic episodes rarely appear by themselves. They usually alternate with depression. Such a mood disorder in both mania and depression are alternately present is sometimes interrupted by periods of normal mood. This is known as bipolar mood disorder. Bipolar mood disorders were earlier referred to as manic depressive disorders. Among the mood disorders, the lifetime risk of suicide attempt is highest in case of bipolar mood disorders. Several risk factors in addition to mental health status of a person predict the likelihood of suicide. These include gender, age, ethnicity, or race, recent occurrence of serious life events. Teenagers and young adults are as much at risk for suicide. As those who are over 70 years. Gender is also an influencing factor, that is, men have a higher rate of contemplated suicide than women. Other factors that affect suicide rates are cultural attitude towards suicide. In Japan, for instance, suicide is culturally appropriate way to deal with feelings of shame and disgrace. Negative expectations, hopelessness, setting unrealistically high standards, and being overcritical in self evaluation are important themes for those who have suicidal preoccupations. Suicide can be prevented by being alert to some of the symptoms, which include changes in eating and sleeping habits, withdrawal from friends, family, and regular activities, violent actions. Rebellious behavior, running away, drug and alcohol abuse, marked personality change, persistent boredom, difficulty in concentration, complaints of physical symptoms, and loss of interest in pleasurable activities. However, seeking help from a professional counselor, psychologist can help to prevent the likelihood of suicide. Schizophrenic disorders. Schizophrenia is a descriptive term for a group of psychotic disorders in which personal, social, and occupational functioning deteriorate as a result of disturbed thought processes, strange perceptions, unusual emotional states, and motor abnormalities. It is debilitating disorder. The social and psychological costs of schizophrenia are tremendous, both to patients as well as to their families and society. Symptoms of schizophrenia. The symptoms of schizophrenia can be grouped into three categories, with positive symptoms of thought, emotion, and behavior, negative symptoms, deficit of thought, emotion, and behavior, and psychomotor symptoms. Positive symptoms are pathological excesses or bizarre additions to a person's behavior, delusions, disorganized thinking and speech, heightened perception and hallucinations, and inappropriate affect are the ones most often found in schizophrenia. Many people with schizophrenia develop delusions. A delusion is a false belief that is firmly held on inadequate grounds. It is not affected by rational argument and has no basis in reality. Delusions of persecution are the most common in schizophrenia. People with this delusion believe that they are being plotted against, spied on, slandered, threatened, attacked, or deliberately victimized. People with schizophrenia may also experience delusion of reference, in which they attach special and personal meaning to the actions of others or to objects and events. And delusion of grandeur, people believe themselves to be especially empowered persons. In delusion of control, they believe that their feelings, thoughts, and actions are controlled by others. People with schizophrenia may not be able to think logically and may speak in peculiar ways. These formal thought disorders can make communication extremely difficult. These include rapidly shifting from one topic to another so that the normal structure of thinking is muddled and becomes illogical, inventing new words or phrases, and persistent and inappropriate repetition of same thoughts. Schizophrenics may have hallucinations, that is, perception that occur in the absence of external stimuli. Auditory hallucinations are the most common in schizophrenia. Patients hear words or voices that speak words, phrases, and sentences directly to the patient, or talk to one another, referring to the patient as third person. Hallucinations can involve other scenes and senses. These include tactile hallucination, somatic hallucination, visual hallucination, gustatory hallucination, and olfactory hallucination. People with schizophrenia also show inappropriate affect, that is, emotions that are unsuited to the situation. Negative symptoms are pathological deficits and include poverty of speech, blunted and flat affect, loss of volition, and social withdrawal. People with schizophrenia show alogia or poverty of speech, that is, a reduction in speech and speech content. Many people with schizophrenia show less anger, sadness, joy, and other feelings than most people do. Thus, they have blunted affect. Some show no emotions at all, a condition known as flat affect. Although patients with schizophrenia experience a volition or apathy or an inability to start or complete a course of action. People with this disorder may withdraw socially and become totally focused on their own ideas and fantasies. People with schizophrenia also show psychomotor symptoms. They move less spontaneously or make odd grimaces and gestures. These symptoms may take extreme forms known as catatonia. People in a catatonic stupor remain motionless and silent for long stretches of time. Some show catatonic rigidity, that is, maintaining a rigid, upright posture for hours. Others exhibit catatonic posturing, that is, assuming awkward, bizarre positions for long periods of time. Subtypes of schizophrenia and their characteristics are briefly described. Behavioral and development disorders. Apart from those mentioned above, there are certain disorders that are specific to children and, if neglected, can lead to serious consequences later in life. Children have less self-understanding and they have not yet developed a stable sense of identity, nor do they have an adequate frame of reference regarding reality, possibility, and value. As a result, they are unable to cope with stressful events, which might be reflected in behavioral and emotional problems. On the other hand, although their inexperience and lack of self-sufficiency make them easily upset by problems that seem minor to an adult, children typically bounce back more quickly. We'll now discuss several disorders of childhood like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, conduct disorder, and separation anxiety disorder. These disorders, if not attended, can lead to more serious and chronic disorders as the child moves into adulthood. Classification of children's disorder has followed a different path. than that of adult disorders. Back has identified two factors, that is externalization and internalization, which include the majority of childhood behavior problems. The externalizing disorders or under control problems include behaviors that are disruptive and often aggressive and aversive to others in the child's environment. The internalizing disorders or over control problems are those conditions where the child experiences depression, anxiety, and discomfort that may not be evident to others. There are several disorders in which children display disruptive or externalizing behaviors. We'll now focus on three prominent disorders, viz. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and conduct disorder. The two main features of ADHD are inattention and hyperactivity impulsivity. Children who are inattentive find it difficult to sustain mental effort during work or play. They have a hard time keeping their minds on any one thing or following instructions. Common complaints that a child does not listen, cannot concentrate, does not follow instructions, is disorganized, easily distracted, forgetful, does not finish assignments, and quick to lose interest in boring activities. Children who are impulsive seem unable to control their immediate reaction or to think before they act. They find it difficult to wait or take turns, have difficulty resisting immediate temptations or delaying gratification. Minor mishaps such as knocking things over are common, whereas more serious accidents and injuries can also occur. Hyperactivity also takes many forms. Children with ADHD are in constant motion. Sitting still through a lesson is impossible for them. The child may fidget, squirm, climb, and run around the room aimlessly. Parents and teachers describe them as driven by a motor, always on the go and talk incessantly. Boys are 4 times more likely to be given this diagnosis than girls. Children with oppositional defiant disorder display age inappropriate amounts of stubbornness, are irritable, defiant, disobedient, and behave in a hostile manner. Unlike ADHD, the rates of odd in boys and girls are not very different. The terms conduct disorder and antisocial behavior refer to age inappropriate actions and attitudes that violate family expectations, societal norms, and the personal or property rights of others. The behaviors typical of conduct disorder include aggressive action that cause or threaten harm to people or animals, non-aggressive conduct that causes property damage, major deceitfulness or theft, and serious rule violations. Children show many different types of aggressive behavior such as verbal aggression, physical aggression, hostile aggression, and proactive aggression. Internalizing disorders include separation anxiety disorder and depression. Separation anxiety disorder is an internalizing disorder unique to children. Its most prominent symptom is excessive anxiety or even panic experienced by children who are being separated from their parents. Children with SAD may have difficulty being in a room by themselves, going to school alone, fearful of entering new situations, and cling to and shadow their parents' every move. To avoid separation, children with SAD may fuss, scream, throw severe tantrums, or make suicidal gestures. The way in which children express and experience depression are related to their level of physical, emotional, and cognitive development. An infant may show sadness by being passive and unresponsive. A preschooler may appear withdrawn and inhibited. A school child may be argumentative and combative, and a teenager may express feelings of guilt and hopelessness. Children may also have serious disorders called pervasive developmental disorders. These disorders are characterized by severe and widespread impairments in social interaction and communication skills, and stereotyped patterns of behaviors, interests, and activities. Autistic disorder or autism is one of the most common of these disorders. Children with autistic disorder have marked difficulties in social interaction and communication, a restricted range of interest, and strong desire for routine. About 70% of children with autism are already mentally retarded. Children with autism experience profound difficulties in relating to other people. They are unable to initiate social behavior and seem unresponsive to other people's feelings. They are unable to share experiences or emotions with others. They also show serious abnormalities in communication and language that persist over time. Many autistic children never develop speech, and those who do have repetitive and deviant speech patterns. Children with autism often show narrow patterns of interest and repetitive behavior such as lining up objects or stereotype body movements such as rocking. These motor movements may be self-stimulatory such as hand flapping or self-injurious such as banging their head against a wall. Another group of disorders which are of special interest to young people are eating disorders. These include anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating. In anorexia nervosa, the individual has a distorted body image that leads him to see himself as overweight, often refusing to eat, exercising compulsively, and developing unusual habits such as refusing to eat in front of others. The anorexic may lose large amounts of weight and even starve herself to death. In bulimia nervosa, the individual may eat excessive amount of food, then purge her body by using medicines such as laxative or diuretics or by vomiting. The person often feels disgusted and ashamed when she or he binges and is relieved of tension and negative emotions and purging. In binge eating, there are frequent episodes of out of control eating. Mental retardation. You have already read about variations in intelligence in chapter 1. Mental retardation refers to below average intellectual functioning and deficits or impairments in adaptive behavior, which are manifested before the age of 18 years. Table 4.2 describes characteristics of mentally challenged persons. Substance use disorders, addictive behavior, whether it involves excessive intake of high calorie food, resulting in extreme obesity, or involving the abuse of substances, such as alcohol or cocaine, is one of the most severe problems being faced by society today. Disorders relating to maladaptive behaviors resulting from regular and consistent use of substance involved are called substance abuse disorders. These disorders include problems associated with using and abusing such drugs as alcohol, cocaine, and heroin, which alter the way people think, feel, and behave. There are two subgroups of substance use disorders: those related to substance dependence and those related to substance abuse. In substance dependence, there is intense craving for the substance to which the person is addicted, and the substance person shows tolerance, withdrawal symptoms, and compulsive drug taking. Tolerance means that the person has to use more and more of a substance to get the same effect. Withdrawal refers to physical symptoms that occur when a person stops or cuts down on the use of a psychoactive substance. That is a substance that has the ability to change an individual's consciousness, mood, and thinking process. In substance abuse, there are recurrent and significant adverse consequences related to use of substances. People who regularly ingest drugs damage their family and social relationships, perform poorly at work, and create physical hazards. We'll now focus on three most common forms of substance abuse: alcohol abuse and dependence, heroin abuse and dependence, and cocaine abuse and dependence. Alcohol abuse and dependence. People who abuse alcohol drink large amounts of regularly and rely on it to help them face difficult situations. Eventually, the drinking interferes with their social behavior and ability to think and work. For many people, the pattern of alcohol abuse extends to dependence, that is, their bodies build up a tolerance for alcohol and they need to drink even greater amounts to feel its effects. They also experience withdrawal responses when they stop drinking. Alcoholism destroys millions of families, social relationships, and careers. Intoxicated drivers are responsible for many road accidents. It also has serious effects on children per persons with this disorder. These children have higher rates of psychological problems, particularly anxiety, depression, phobias, and sustain related disorders. Excessive drinking can seriously damage physical health. Some of the ill effects of alcohol on health and psychological functioning are presented. Heroin abuse and dependence. Heroin intake significantly interferes with social and occupational functioning. Most abusers further develop a dependence on heroin, revolving their lives around the substance, building up a tolerance for it, and experiencing withdrawal reaction when they stop taking it. The most direct danger of heroin abuse is an overdose, which flows down the respiratory centers in the brain, almost paralyzing breathing and in many cases causing death. Cocaine abuse and dependence. Regular use of cocaine. Regular use of cocaine may lead to a pattern of abuse in which the person may be intoxicated throughout the day and function poorly in social relationships and at work. It may also cause problems in short term memory and attention. Dependence may develop so that cocaine dominates the personal life. More of the drug is needed to get desired effect, and stopping it results in feeling of depression, fatigue, and sleep problems, irritability, and anxiety. Cocaine poses serious dangers. It has dangerous effects on psychological functioning and physical well-being. Some of the commonly abused substances are given in box. Summary: abnormal behavior is behavior that is deviant, distressing, dysfunctional, and dangerous. Those behaviors are seen as abnormal, which represent a deviation from social norms and which interfere with optimal functioning and growth. In the history of abnormal behavior, the three perspectives are the supernatural, biological, and organic, and the psychological. In interactional or biopsychosocial approach, all three factors, which biological, psychological, and social, play important roles in psychological disorders. Classification of psychological disorders has been done by WHO and American Psychiatric Association. A variety of models have been used to explain abnormal behavior. These are biological, psychodynamic, behavioral, cognitive, humanistic, existential, diathesis, stress systems, and sociocultural approaches. The major psychological disorders include anxiety, somatoform, dissociative mood, schizophrenic, development and behavioral, and substance use disorders.